In the next two slide casts, we're going to look at that tendering process in a little bit more detail. So what we're going to start with is the first part of it, which is the tender period. This is where we invite tenders, we issue the contract, the tender documents, and there's up to the tender submission and opening. So let's look at each part in turn. The tender invitation. The objective of the tender invitation is to advise potential tenderers, to potential construction companies, that this contract is being tendered. They might know about it, but some of them might know about it, but you want to broadcast it to everyone. So the way you might do it is you might write letters to, if you're doing selective tender, you might write letters to companies that you know might be interested and can do the job, or you might write letters to the Contractors Federation. You might put advertisements in the paper, the newspaper, or you might put tenders, the advertisements on the tendering website. So there's Local Government Online, which is a website which has all of the tenders for local government. And there's several types of tendering websites that most contractors subscribe to. So this is a screenshot from the Local Government Online. You can see that it shows it inviting tenders for the Stompbacks remedial phase work, phase 4. You can see that the client is identified, the regional council. It's not. It should identify it. The contract number, the contract name. It describes the project in a little bit of detail, so contractors can look at it and say, yes, we can do that, or no, we're not interested. The quantities, the size of it. So once again, they can look at it and say, yes, can we do this or not? Then it tells you when it starts. It tells you how to get a hold of the tender documents. It tells you about a site meeting, and then it tells you when the tender document, the tender bid, has to be submitted. So it gives you all the information you need. First of all, it tells you, if you're the contractor, do I want to do this or not? Then it tells you, yes, if I do want to do it, how can I get a hold of the tender documents? When do I have to have my tender bid in? After the tender invitation, there's usually a period of, can be 3 to 4 weeks normally, where the tenderers put together their tender bids. They get prices from subbies to do subcontractor work. They'll get prices for the materials. They'll figure out how they're going to do the work. They'll figure out how much time, and they'll work up a price for it. So they'll be putting together all of that information. Now there's tendering rules set out in NZS 3910. We'll be looking at these in class. It's very important that you're aware of it. So there are rules that sort of say things along the lines of you're allowed to submit tenders in this format or not. What happens if you can't get on site, all that sort of stuff. And in the tender period, there's also communication between the engineer and the contractor. You're talking to each other, so we'll look at that in a bit more detail later on. And communications, set up meetings, notice to tenderers. So I mentioned that there's communication between the engineer and the tenderer. So here's what both parties do. Normally what happens is the client will just hand over the tendering process to the engineer. Remember, the engineer is also known as the consultant, same thing. So during that time, that period, the engineer is responding to queries from these tenderers. So here's our tenderers here, they're a real happy lot. So they're asking questions, clarifications. Is it okay if we use stainless steel bolts instead of galvanized steel bolts, for example? All those sort of questions. Suggestions, this is the way we propose to do the work. Does that work for you? And the engineer is responding back. He might be clarifying stuff, saying yes, you can use stainless steel bolts if you want to. There might be changes. These guys might identify stuff that doesn't work, and the engineer might have to change the tender document slightly. And he might be providing additional information. So each time one of these guys asks a question, the engineer will say, oh, I guess the rest of them need to know about it as well. So he'll be providing the additional information. And the way he does that is what's called a notice to tenderers, which is a formal notice which is sent out to all the tenderers and says this is additional information about the tender, or this is a change to the tender, or whatever it is. And that becomes part of the contract agreement later on. So these are all formal communications. And remember, I mentioned that a contract is a legally binding agreement. Each one of these slightly modifies that agreement. So it's quite important that it's all recorded down properly. So as I said, during the tender period, the tenderers are all obtaining the tender documentation, figuring out how they're going to do the work, what resources they need, subcontractors, suppliers, and then the contract price. Then they prepare the tender submission, and they need to have it in on time. So there's usually a closing date, tender submission. This tender submission date it's a time and a date and a place. It says you have to have your tender bids into this tender box at these offices at this particular place at 4 o'clock, say, on this date. Okay, at 4:01 someone comes along and closes that tender box, and no one can submit tenders after that time. There are no extensions. The tenders close at that time, so it's very important that that be done properly.